The morning the first of those 7 combines came up my lane. It was a Tuesday in late September, the year the wet fall broke the county in half, and the fog was lying so low across the bottom ground that the flatbed hauling it looked like it was floating in off some other world. I was 68 that autumn, and I had been farming that same section of black dirt for going on 44 years. And I will tell you honestly that I had never in my life spent money the way the town would come to talk about that day. 7. Combines. Old ones. The kind of iron that sits in a fence row until the trees grow up through the header. I bought all 7 at a farm dispersal, 2 counties over, for $11,200, which comes to $1,600 a machine, which is roughly what a man pays for a decent used 4-wheeler, and I hauled them home over 3 days because I only had the one flatbed and no great hurry. The auctioneer that day had actually skipped over them at first, waved his hand at the whole row like he was shooing flies, and told the crowd, "We'll get to the scrap iron after lunch." That was the word he used. Scrap iron. And the crowd laughed, the easy laugh of men who are certain, and I stood at the back with my hands in my coat pockets and let them laugh, because I was already doing arithmetic in my head that none of them could see. I didn't know yet standing there exactly what those old machines knew that the new ones didn't, but I suspected. I suspected because of a notebook, and I will get to the notebook, because you can't understand the combines without it. First, you have to understand how deep a hole a man can dig for himself in a single afternoon and how it looks to everybody watching. Because it looked bad. It looked like an old man had finally lost the thread. By the time I got the 3rd one chained down and pulled out onto the county road, a fellow I have known 30 years, drives one of those trucks so clean you could set out a meal on the tailgate, rolled up alongside me at the stop by the elevator, and put his window down. He is not a cruel man. I want to say that plainly because the story does not work if he is a villain, and he wasn't. He is just a man who is comfortable being sure. "What in the world," he said, "are you going to do with 7 combines that don't run?" And I told him the truth, which was almost nothing. I told him I was going to make them run. He looked at that rusted machine on my trailer the way you'd look at a horse with 3 legs, kind of pained on my behalf, and he said, "There's a reason those were the cheap ones," and he put his window up and drove on. He wasn't wrong about the reason. There was a reason. He just had the reason backward, and it would take a wet October to turn it right side up. Now I want to be honest about my reasons, because a man telling this kind of story likes to make himself out smarter than he was, and I was not smart that September. I was stubborn, which is a different thing, and I was carrying a memory I couldn't put down. Those 7 combines were all the same make and near the same vintage. Machines from the late 70s and early 80s. Big, square, honest things with steel, where the new ones have plastic, and mechanical linkages where the new ones have a computer that has to talk to a satellite before it will let you cut your own wheat. I grew up running a machine like that. My father ran one before me. And the thing I could not stop turning over in my mind was something my father told me in the fall of 1971, when I was 15 years old, and we were sitting in the cab of a combine that had quit on us in the middle of a soft sopping bottom field, the kind of ground that will swallow a boot to the ankle. It had rained for 11 straight days that November. Half the county's grain was still standing in the mud, rotting on the stalk, because nothing could get out into it. And my father, who did not waste words, wiped his hands on a rag and said, "The day will come when the ground is too wet for the new machines and just wet enough for the old ones. When that day comes, son, the man with the light machine and the narrow track is going to look at the man with the heavy machine and the wide track like he found gold in a ditch." I didn't understand it then. I was 15, and I wanted to be home. But it lodged in me the way a splinter lodges, and it worked its way to the surface 53 years later when I saw 7 of those exact, heavy, wide, unfashionable machines lined up under an auctioneer's contempt for $1,600 apiece. That was my reason. A dead man's sentence, half understood, and a hunch about whether I had no right to have. That And the notebook, which I hadn't even opened yet at the auction, I bid on the memory. The notebook came later, and the notebook is what turned the memory into a plan. The notebook I am talking about was my father's, and I want to describe it exactly, because the how of finding it matters. It was a marbled composition book, the black and white speckled kind, with the corners gone soft and round like river stones, and the cover had a water ring on it, where a coffee cup had sat some time back before I was grown. I found it the week after the auction when I went looking through the workbench crate in the old machine shed for a set of feeler gauges, and there it was, underneath a coil of baling wire, my father's handwriting on the front in pencil, gone brown with age, machine notes. Now, I had known that notebook existed in the loose way you know things about a dead parent, but I had never sat down with it, and I will own that I put it back on the bench that first evening, because I wasn't ready. That is the plain truth. My father had been gone 19 years by then. He died in the spring of the year I turned 49. And reading a man's handwriting is a way of hearing his voice. And some evenings you are not up to hearing it. So the notebook sat on my bench for 11 days while I worked on the combines. And it wasn't until a hard rain drove me inside on the second Sunday in October that I finally sat down under the single bulb over the bench and opened it. Most of it was exactly what the cover said. Machine notes. Column after column in his careful hand of belt sizes, chain lengths, the part number for a feeder house shaft, the gap you want on a certain concave, torque figures, the date he replaced a variable speed pulley, and how many acres it had on it when it failed. It was the record of a man who trusted iron and distrusted his own memory. And it was worth more to me than the combines themselves, because a machine you can fix if you know its secrets, and here were 40 years of secrets. But it was on the last written page, near the back, that I found the line that made the hair stand up on my arms. The line was set apart from the columns, written slower and darker than the rest. The pencil pressed in like he wanted it to stay, and it had been underlined twice. It said, "Wide track floats where new ones sink. Kept the 71 running the year everyone else quit. Ground carries the weight, if you spread it." And then, underneath, circled with a question mark he never answered, 3 words that I read a dozen times that night. Deflate the tires? Now I need to explain what those words meant to a farmer, because that circle and that question mark were the whole hinge of it. Those old combines rode on big flotation tires, wide and tall, and my father had wondered and apparently never fully tested whether you could let some air out of them on purpose, drop the pressure way down so the tires spread out flat and long against soft ground. The way a snowshoe carries a man across snow that would otherwise swallow him. It is a real thing. Engineers call it a footprint. The wider you spread the weight, the less the machine sinks. And those old heavy machines already had the widest, softest tires that anybody ever put under a combine, because back then nobody was trying to make them light and fast, they were trying to make them tough. The new machines the whole county was so proud of ran on narrow, tall tires or on tracks, pumped hard for road speed and fuel savings, built for dry ground and asphalt, built for a world that assumed the sun would shine when you needed it. My father had seen, back in 1971, that the old fat machines could go where the modern thinking said no machine should go. He had proven it once, and written it down, and then being a cautious man, put a question mark on the last piece he hadn't nailed down. He left me the answer half-finished, like a man leaving his son a field with one corner still to plow. And I sat there under that bulb with the rain coming down on the shed roof, and I understood finally what I had bought. I had not bought 7 pieces of scrap iron. I had bought 7 snowshoes for a flood that hadn't come yet, and the notebook was telling me the sky was about to turn. The 3 weeks after that passed slowly, the way the important weeks always do, and I spent them in that shed, getting the machines right, while the weather made up its mind. I will not pretend it was quick or clean work. Of the 7 combines, 3 ran when I got them, in the sense that they would start and move under their own power, and 4 did not. I went through all 7, the way my father's notebook taught me to, and I want to give you the honest tally, because the numbers are the story. I replaced 11 belts across the 7 machines, 5 feeder house chains, 2 variable speed pulleys that were exactly the failure my father had recorded decades before on the same model, and I rebuilt 3 fuel systems that had gone to varnish from sitting. I spent, all told, $4,300 on parts, most of it ordered off the part numbers written in that notebook, which saved me days of guessing. So my total was in the machines now at $15,500, which is $11,200 for the iron and $4,300 for the parts. And for that money, I had 7 working combines. When a single new one of the kind my neighbors ran would set a man back better than $500,000. And a used one that was only 10 years old was still north of $100,000. Even at the diner they had to admit I hadn't overpaid, though the version that went around by that point had grown the way things grow at the diner. Until I heard from my own wife that I was supposed to have bought 30 combines and gone plumb broke doing it. She listened to that report without a word, set down her coffee, and asked me the only question that mattered, which was, do they run or don't they? I told her all 7 ran. She said, then they can quit talking. That was the whole conversation, and it was worth more than a month of reassurance from anybody else. But the part of that work I remember best, the part that made me trust the whole gamble, was the tires. I dropped the pressure on the first machine down and down, watching the fat tire spread out flat and long against the concrete floor, and I ran it out into the muddy lot behind the shed, where a normal tractor left ruts to the axle, and that big old combine walked across the soft ground like it was walking on a table. It floated. My father's underlined line was true, and his question mark was answered. 53 years late, by his own son, standing in the mud, grinning like a fool. Then the rain came, and it did not stop, and the wet fall my father had described to a 15-year-old boy arrived, right on the schedule of a dead man's prophecy. It started the 3rd week of October, and it settled in over the whole region like it meant to live there. Not storms, nothing dramatic. Just gray day after gray day, a soft, steady, soaking rain that put 1.5 inches down one week and 2 inches the next, and never let the ground dry between. By the 1st of November, the county was a slough. The corn and beans were ready, dead ripe, drying in the field the way grain does, but nobody could get to it, because the modern machines, the beautiful expensive machines on their narrow tires and their hard-pumped tracks, sank. I watched it happen at my neighbor's place across the road, the man with the clean truck, a good farmer with a machine worth more than my house, and I watched that machine bury itself to the belly in his own bean field before it had cut 200 yards, and I watched a second tractor go in, trying to pull it out, and I watched both of them sit there for 3 days while the rain kept falling and the beans kept shattering and dropping their yield onto the mud. It was not a good thing to watch. There is no joy in a neighbor's grain going down in the field, and I want to be clear, I took none. But out my own window sat 7 old fat machines with the air let out of their tires, and I knew what they could do, because I had already watched one of them walk across ground exactly that soft. The extension agent came around that first week of November. Decent young fellow with a clean tan Carhartt and a clipboard, going farm to farm doing what they call a harvest loss assessment, and he stood in my lot and looked at my 7 combines and then at his columns of numbers, and he told me kindly, the way you tell a man bad news, realistically you're looking at a total loss on the wet bottom ground. Nothing's going out into that. The moisture readings are off the chart. My recommendation is to write off the low fields and wait for a freeze. He meant well. His number was designed to end the conversation the way their numbers always are. He did not stay long enough to see what I could see, and when he'd driven off I put on my coat and went out and started the first combine. I will tell you about the day we cut the first wet field, because it is the day the whole county turned around, and it turned around quietly, the way real things do. It was a Tuesday, again, the second Tuesday of November, 41 degrees, the fog burning off slow, and I took the lightest and fittest of the 7 machines down into the bottom ground that the extension agent had told me to write off. The ground so soft that my own boots sank in it. I had the tire pressure down to where those fat old tires were spread out flat and wide, and I want to give you the number because the number is the miracle. A normal combine puts something like 30 pounds per square inch down onto the ground through its tires. And I had that old machine down to where it was putting less than 9 pounds. Less than a man puts down through the sole of his boot. And that heavy old combine went down into that bottom. And it floated. And it cut. And it kept cutting. And it did not sink. It left a track you could barely see. I cut 40 acres of that written-off ground the first day and put the grain in the bin at moisture I could dry. And I did it with a machine an auctioneer had called scrap iron, running on my father's underlined sentence and a tire gauge. Quart of that does not stay quiet in a county where everybody's grain is drowning. By that evening, a truck I did not recognize was idling at the end of my lane, and then another, and by the next morning, there were men standing in my lot with their caps in their hands, good, proud men, asking a thing that is very hard for a farmer to ask, which is help. And I want to be honest about what I felt, standing there, because it was not triumph. It was my father. I felt him standing next to me the way you feel a man in a place he loved. Because I had 6 more machines that ran, and I had 6 neighbors and their sons who knew how to run a combine, and I had a notebook that told me exactly how low to drop every tire. And up beyond us in every direction was a county full of ripe grain going down in the mud, waiting on the only machines that could reach it. We ran all 7 of those old combines for 19 days straight, every hour the light allowed, and we cut grain that every expert in the region had already written off. And I want to close by telling you what came of it and what it meant, because the meaning is the only part that lasts. Between my ground and the neighbors who came asking, those 7 machines brought in better than 2,400 acres of grain that would otherwise have rotted where it stood, and at the prices that fall, with everybody short and the elevators paying up for what little was coming in. That grain was worth more than $1 million that would simply not have existed. I didn't charge my neighbors what I could have. I charged them fuel and a fair custom rate, and I let the sons run the machines so they'd learn the ground, and I made enough that fall to more than pay back the $15,500 I had in the iron many times over. But that was never really the point, and it would be a lie to pretend it was. The point came on the last day, when the man with the clean truck, the one who'd put his window up on me in September, stood in my lot as we washed the mud off the last combine. He didn't make a speech. He looked at that old machine a long moment, and he said, "That's not as much junk as I thought it was." And then he got in his truck and drove on, and that was the whole of it, and it was plenty. The quiet validation came later, from an old engineer at the tire company I called, with a question, who went silent when I told him what pressure we'd run and how many acres without a machine going down, and then said one word, "remarkable," and asked if he could write it up. But the concession from my neighbor is the one I keep. So here is what my father knew, and what those old machines knew, and what I finally learned at 68, standing in the mud. The world is always in a hurry to call a thing worthless, because it is old and heavy and out of fashion, and the world is almost always measuring by a dry weather ruler. Worth is not the same as fashion, and it is not the same as price, and the thing everybody skips over after lunch is sometimes the only thing that can walk across the flood. My father wrote, "Ground carries the weight if you spread it," and I have come to think that is true of more than tires. If you have got your own piece of scrap iron, your own dismissed and dusty thing that you suspect is worth more than they say, I would truly like to hear about it down in the comments. And if this meant something to you, go ahead and subscribe, because we move slow on this channel, but we always get there.